The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is a big view picture of the economy. With the model, we can identify where the economy is sitting at the present time and identify policies that might be needed. If the economy is too slow, this would mean slow GDP growth and higher than acceptable unemployment. If the economy is operating too fast, inflation is present and real wages are declining. Now we will look at the aggregate demand and supply model. It's similar to our basic and simple supply and demand model. In the simple model, demand represents the sum of all buyers for the product and supply is the sum of all production of the product by producers in the market. Equilibrium is where the demand and supply curves intersect. The vertical axis is labeled price and the horizontal axis is labeled quantity. Now we will look at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. The first thing we note is that the labels are different. The vertical axis is price level. The horizontal axis is real output rather than quantity. The demand curve represents the sum of all the purchases made in the macro economy. The components that make up aggregate demand is the sum of all purchases made in the U.S. economy. C is for consumers. Business purchases are shown as I. Government purchases are shown as G. Net exports is shown as X minus M, which is the value of exported goods minus the value of imported goods. Exports are purchases made by other countries from the U.S. Imports are purchases made by the U.S. from foreign countries. It is noted that C plus I plus G plus X minus M are the components that make up GDP, gross domestic product. The short-run aggregate supply curve is the sum of all production of the economy. It slopes upward to the right. That means it is responsive to the increasing prices in the economy. At higher prices, producers will increase production. The short-run aggregate supply curve is the sum of all production in the economy. Unlike GDP, which is made up of four components, the short-run aggregate supply in the United States is basically the production of businesses. It includes products and services. Now, when the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curve are put together, the intersection of the two curves represents a short-run equilibrium in the macroeconomy. Now, the question is, does this equilibrium position satisfy the macro goals of economic growth, price stability, and low unemployment? To help discern how the economy is performing with this model, we need another curve called the long-run aggregate supply curve. The curve is a vertical line. The vertical line implies a level of output that is not responsive to prices. Why is that? The assumption is that at full employment, the economy is going as fast as it can. In the short run, it can respond to price fluctuations, but in the long run, prices will end up on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now we combine all three curves in the model: aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. We show an equilibrium where all three curves intersect. Ideally, the intersection of all three curves will be at the full employment level of output, at a price level that is acceptable in terms of inflation. This equilibrium satisfies the macro goals of growth, price stability, and low unemployment. What if the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curves intersect to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve at the full employment level of output? Then the economy is experiencing low growth, high unemployment. What if the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curves intersect to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve at the full employment level of output? Then the macroeconomy is experiencing high prices and inflation. To get back to an equilibrium at full employment, policymakers will need to pursue appropriate monetary and fiscal policies. It is a delicate balance for policymakers to move the economy to achieve macro goals without overcompensating and creating further issues. More on that to come. Thanks for listening.